It's really great to see so many friends old and new here joining us. I'm Karen Wolf, I'm the director of the OI, and it's a wonderful pleasure to welcome you all to this event. We are so fortunate to have Cate Denial back with us today to talk about a pedagogy of kindness, something I think we all feel that we could use, both incoming and outgoing. I am really looking forward to learning and thinking about, alongside all of you, some of the challenges that have come with pandemic and some of those that have perhaps just become more apparent to us. Cate shared some of her thoughts with us last month on how we can make breathing room for ourselves and our students. And the video of that event will be up on the OI website by the first part of next week. So I encourage you to visit it if you didn't have a chance to join us in December. I'm going to briefly introduce Cate, and then I'm going to turn things right over to her. And if you have questions, as you likely have seen in the chat, please post them there. And about 45 minutes in, I'll start asking Cate some of those questions. I'll do my best to get to as many as possible. I'm also going to ask everyone to be really conscious of keeping yourself muted. I know all these months into Zoom and still muting and unmuting can be a little bit challenging, but I'm going to ask you to be conscious of that because like everyone else, I am working from home. So like everyone else, I have creatures capable of making all kinds of disruptive sounds, my aging dog, my kids, my spouse. Anyway, never mind, I won't go on. But muting is good. Muting is powerful here in this context. So what a pleasure to have Cate back. As I said, Cate Denial is a really exceptional scholar, teacher, and thought leader. She is the Bright Distinguished Professor of American History and chair of the History Department and director of the Bright Institute at Knox College. She's the winner of the American Historical Association's 2018 Eugene Asher Distinguished Teaching Award, and she's a former member of the Digital Public Library of America's Educational Advisory Board. Cate's historical research is examining the early 19th century experience of pregnancy, childbirth, and childrearing in Upper Midwestern Ojibwe and missionary cultures. And this grows out of her first book, Making Marriage, Husband, Wives, and the American State in Dakota and Ojibwe Country. Cate's currently also at work on a wonderful book, A Pedagogy of Kindness, under contract with West Virginia University Press. And I know I'm looking forward to that. Cate, take it away.
Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are located. I'm going to share my screen and get some slides going here. So just 1 second. All right, we're here today to talk about a pedagogy of kindness. And I'm looking forward to your questions after my presentation because there is so much to talk about here and we have so little time. So please put your questions in the chat as we're going through. First, I want to make sure everybody is comfortable with Zoom. I know that most of us are by this point, but it's always a good idea to just check. So your mic is muted, as you will see on the far left screen, and you can turn your video on and off as makes you comfortable right next to it. You can see who else is here by clicking on the participants button, and you can ask a question or make a comment in the chat. You can also find emoji reactions over on the right-hand side. I always want to start my presentations by thanking my teachers. I'm also going to read a lot of these slides in case there's anybody who has reading difficulties or sight difficulties to make sure that they know what I'm saying. So my gratitude goes to Jesse Stommel, Sean Michael Morris, and Chris Friend at the Digital Pedagogy Lab, Charles Bailing and Roger Fisher at the Program on Intergroup Relations at the University of Michigan, Karen Ray Costa, Clea Mahoney, Judith Duthill, and Melissa Whaler from the Online Learning Toolkit, and my colleagues at Knox College, among them Gabriel Rayleigh, Nikki Malley, Jennifer Foubert, Deirdre Doherty, and Mary Arman. So here's our agenda for today. First of all, grab some paper and a pen or a pencil or open up a doc because there's going to be a couple of moments where I'm going to ask you to do some free writing. I'm going to start with a very brief introduction to me as a teacher, and then I'm going to talk about what a pedagogy of kindness is and is not. Then I'm going to move on to talk about how justice is involved in this, and then believing students, and then believing in students, which are crucial parts of a pedagogy of kindness. So first, an introduction. From 1994 to 1996, I was a graduate student at the UW-Milwaukee, where I got my master's degree in history. I was a first-generation student, and I was new to the US educational system. So this was, as you can imagine, quite the trip. In those 2 years, I was a teaching assistant for the American Indian History Survey class with Brenda Child. And I discovered in teaching those classes that I wanted to teach college students potentially forever. My first day, however, was terrifying. I was scared silly. I had graduated in July because in England, where I'm from, the educational system moves a little differently, has a different timetable. So there was 1 month between my graduation and my standing in front of a classroom of students. I felt like the most giant imposter. I thought that I was supposed to know something before I taught it, and so I just felt awful. So I had to come up with a solution for this, and my solution was to pretend that I was Dana Scully from the X-Files. So every day before I had to go into the classroom to teach, I would ask myself, what would Dana Scully do? And then I would put myself in that mindset and walk into the classroom and begin. So this is our first moment of free writing. I would love for you to take just 5 minutes here to think back to your first day of teaching. How did you feel? What did you know or not know? If your very first day of teaching is still ahead of you, what are your hopes and fears about that? Please take 5 minutes and I will keep time and bring us back together when that's done. Okay, that's 5 minutes. So finish up whatever it is that you're writing right now. So the reason that I asked you that question is because what happens when we begin to teach stays with us for a very long time. We often emulate previous teachers we've had when we start out as teachers ourselves. And that means we usually have a lot to unlearn to become the teachers that we want to be. Knowing who we are and where we've come from is a prerequisite for teaching with kindness. So, pedagogy of kindness. What actually is this? What it's not. It is not being nice. Nice is a band-aid that we often put over deep fissures and wounds in our institutions. And nice lies. Nice lies about precarity, about imbalances of power, and about things that are tradition, that have always been done a certain way at our institution. We want no part of that. So what is the pedagogy of kindness? It's about justice. It's about believing people. And it's about believing in students. So once again, I want to give you a moment to free write. Martina Spada said, "No change for the good ever happens without it being imagined first, even if that change seems hopeless or impossible in the present." And I first came across this quote from Mariam Kaba, who many of you will know is a prison abolitionist, when she gave a talk at a synagogue in Chicago last fall for Yom Kippur. So take a moment to imagine this. What could a pedagogy of kindness mean for you? Put down all your thoughts, your hopes, and your fears and concerns too. Take 5 minutes, and again, I will keep time for you. Okay, that's 5 minutes. Please finish up what you're writing. So hopefully now you have a list of your hopes for what this could be, as well as a list of your concerns and fears. And I hope that we can answer some questions about some of those concerns at the end of this. The reason for taking some time to think about that is that we want to be honest with ourselves. Kindness does not lie. Remember, that's niceness. So we want to be honest with ourselves about what we're bringing with us when we come into this situation. So I said that a pedagogy of kindness, that the first thing that was involved was justice. So this is where I want to give you a little data on undergraduate student populations. 71% of undergraduate students are non-traditional, using Chris McDonald's definition of that term. That definition is at least 25 years old, attend school part-time, work full-time, a veteran, have children, wait at least 1 year after high school before entering college, have a GED instead of a high school diploma, are a first-generation student, are enrolled in non-degree programs, or have re-entered a college program. That percentage is probably higher than your institutions count as first generation, but I think it's important to think about how many of our students are dealing with things that fall outside the traditional idea of what a student is. 45% of undergraduate students are BIPOC, so that's Black, Indigenous, or person of color. That is up 15% since 2005. 20% of undergraduate students identify as LGBTQIA+, but that's probably a low estimate, as it's not safe for everyone to be able to share their identity. 60% of students at two-year colleges and 48% of students at four-year colleges have experienced housing insecurity in the past year. And 48% of students at two-year colleges and 41% of students at four-year colleges have experienced food insecurity. So what does all of this have to do with kindness? The first thing is that we need to be aware of our assumptions. Where do we presume that we know our students without any evidence that we really do? We need to give our students the benefit of the doubt. That costs us absolutely nothing. And we need to get rid of the hoops that we so often try to make students jump through. We need to believe in what and how much students are saying. So for example, it means saying, yes, you can have an extension when someone comes to say they need one, without asking for private details or lots of documentation. So I'm going to talk about what this means in terms of assignments so that we have a concrete idea of what a pedagogy of kindness looks like in practice. So we're going to look at design, at self-evaluations, and at grading. And this all leads into point 4, believe students. So here are some common excuses that I have heard around assignments. My printer broke, I was sick, someone died, and my laptop crashed. And in each of these different scenarios, I would suggest that you believe the student telling you this. The reason is very simple. It cultivates trust between you and your students, and word gets around very fast in classes as to how that relationship is going between you and your students. There is, of course, always risk involved, and a lot of people wonder if there isn't the risk that someone's going to pull one over on us. That's true, but there's also another greater risk, is that we will disbelieve students who are in genuine crisis. This all means a lot of change. It means rethinking our syllabi, our assignments, our activities, and our homework with trust in mind. Which leads me to believing in students. In 2017, I went to the Digital Pedagogy Lab workshop at Mary Washington in Virginia. In the track that I was in, we were constantly asked to think about who the student was that we had in mind when we were writing our syllabi and assignments. We were asked to think about what we communicated about who we are in the way that we talked about our policies, and whether our assignments were as accessible to as many students as possible. Now, by 2017, I was pretty sure I was a crack teacher. But when I started to ask these questions and look at what I had written, I came up short. I had to admit that the student I imagined as my audience when I wrote was someone I did not trust. I communicated that I was in a position of unassailable authority and I was not approachable in the way that I wrote my policies. And my students were not finding my written documents accessible. Instead, they were finding a wall of text. So here is what my assignments used to look like. There are 3 slides here because there was so much text on my assignment sheet, I couldn't put it on just one slide. So here what you'll see are a few things. Some very, very formal language for introducing the assignment itself. And that you'll see that I specify exactly how many books and articles and websites they can and cannot use, and that they may not use Wikipedia or encyclopedia articles in that tally. This also communicated my experience of sometimes having students who did these things that I didn't want them to do. As I graded their papers, this section does nothing but tell them how much I distrusted them. I told them what their introduction should be, what their thesis statement should be, that they needed strong organization. And I can tell you that I was not backing this up with enough conversation about these pieces in class itself. Then there was the checklist at the end of the assignment, telling them what they had to think about before they turned anything in. And the message there was, I've been burned before, thank you very much. So I was very specific about that they should have a thesis and a conclusion. And sure, in the past, I had students that omitted a conclusion. But imagine reading this as a competent student who was kind of insulted that I would presume they wouldn't do such a thing. You can also see, that I told them they must use Chicago style, but I did not link them to it. And then at the end, the 12-point font, the double spacing, the 1-inch margins, those were all about the fact that I was communicating, I think you're going to try and cheat. This is what my assignment now looks like. This is from fall of last year. You can see I have a very cheerful header on this. And while that might seem like something that you shouldn't be concerned about, it is about reducing anxiety amongst the student body and making sure that they know this is approachable. This assignment is open-ended. Students co-create this assignment with me. It's about assessing their learning and not about assessing their writing. I have other assignments that do that. So this assignment says, show me what you've learned this term in any medium but a paper. And they get to decide the rest of the parameters. I do provide some scaffolding, things that they need to turn in, things that they should remember to include, but these are so that they are not completely lost and at sea as they start this assignment rather than me being sort of petty. You'll see on the left, there are icons. These are for students who have difficulty navigating large pieces of text, whether it's because they have ADHD or some kind of disability when it comes to reading. This helps them navigate the text more easily. And I restate the due dates. Again, this is because I know for many of my students who struggle with attention that it helps them to have the due dates in multiple places. There's also some design stuff here. The font is called Open Sans, and it's deliberately designed to be readable by people who have dyslexia. I don't use a lot of red or green in the assignment sheet, and that's because I may have students who have red-green color deficiency. And I do link to the Chicago Manual of Style this time directly from the assignment sheet. And I give them a very short reminder of what it is that means we cite. I also have my students work with me on collaborating on their grading. So at the beginning of term, I bring in a checklist. This is just one part of that checklist that has some suggestions for how we might grade papers and other assignments. This is for C, and you can see all the different things that go into earning a C in my classes. But what's important is that this document is not finished when I give it to them. I ask students what seems fair, what seems unfair, what would they like to change the wording on, where can we make some edits? And until we have all agreed on the entire document and come to a consensus, the grading standards do not apply. Once we have reached consensus, then I upload the grading guidelines to our LMS, our learning management software, and then they apply to everybody's work for the rest of term. I also have my students fill in a self-evaluation sheet. Now, this is something that's very scalable, whether you are teaching small seminars or you're teaching 300 students. You can have a self-evaluation sheet that you take into account when grading the student's assignment. So these early questions from one of the self-evaluations that my students use are linked directly to what it takes to earn a C in my class. Some of the questions further down are linked to what it takes to earn a B in the class. But while these are mostly yes or no questions, the questions at the end of the self-evaluation are really important. These are open-ended questions. How is this paper an act of exploring new intellectual territory for you? What discoveries did you make about yourself in writing this paper? How could you improve for your next assignment? And is there anything else I should know? These are spaces where I learn a tremendous amount about my students and what was happening in their lives at the moment that they wrote their paper or prepared their other assignment forms. This is where they'll tell me that someone died. This is where they'll tell me that they were terribly sick or were having a bad mental health week. This is where they will come up with concrete ways that they can improve before they do a next assignment. This is where they'll tell me, I had never considered this before. Because most of the classes that I teach are quite small, I can then collaborate with my students on the final part of grading, which is assigning a grade. I have to assign a grade by the rules of my institution. Some institutions are more flexible about that. But I invite my students in for a conversation. I read their self-evaluation, and then we discuss what grade they should get. If they pitch their grade higher or lower than I would, and honestly, it's almost always that they pitch it lower, we have a conversation about why I would give them the grade that I would, and if they're comfortable with that grade. I have never, since I instituted this, had a student who was not happy with that. The other thing I would say is that being able to talk to students is less time consuming than line editing a paper. And students actually believe me when I tell them that they're doing things right. My students tell me that they all know about the poop sandwich at the end of a paper, where we say something nice, then we tell them what they did wrong, and then say something nice again. All they focus on is what we told them that they did wrong. They see no reason to believe the good stuff. But when I'm talking to them, then they believe me. So believing in students means all those concrete things, and it believes in our students' ability to have input. It means believing in students' ability to co-create syllabi and assignments. It means giving students investment in courses which they shape. It means collaboration. So I want to give you another moment to free write and think about one thing you could immediately change about your assignments to make them more welcoming and collaborative. Take a couple minutes and I will keep time. Remember, you're not looking to make every change possible all at once. Just think of one thing you could immediately do. Okay, please finish up what you're writing. To recap, there are 3 pieces to a pedagogy of kindness. The first is to think about justice. The second is to believe students. The third is to believe in students. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm excited to take your questions. And if you'd like to contact me outside of this forum, my email is cdenial@knox.edu. You can find me on Twitter at cjdenial, and I have a blog and other resources at catherinedenial.org. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Cate. There we are. That was lovely. Thank you so much. I feel like that was inspiring, and also provided some more oxygen in necessary oxygen in an oxygen poor environment of late. So thank you. A couple of questions that have come up in the chat, and then another question I wanted to ask you about. So one very practical one from Naomi is, do you have a document for the student self-evaluation that you can share?
Absolutely. Yes, I will make that available to people.
Okay, cool. That is great. And another question that Carrie asks is whether you still use grading rubrics.
I do not use grading rubrics. The reason that I've stopped using grading rubrics is because I found that it limited what my students could imagine. The good thing about rubrics is that they sort of march a student through the things they should consider when writing their paper. But the downside of that is that it means they only think there are those ways to work, right? It sort of limits their expression. So I find other ways to teach them how to think clearly about what the assignment is asking, but also to bring themselves to that project. I haven't had problems with students sort of going off the rails without rubrics, But with rubrics, I have had a problem of students writing very formulaic prose and hitting every mark on the rubric, and yet it's still not the paper that you really want to see. So for example, one of the first assignments that I give in my first year courses is an assignment that asks them to pick something they've learned from the first 4 weeks of class and write a letter to someone very specific, telling them about it and why it's important. So they can choose anyone. A lot of people choose a family member or a friend, but you can choose anyone. So someone wrote to Jim from The Office last fall. And you are thinking about audience as you do that, right?
Yeah.
And you're also constructing an argument because you're telling them not just that this thing exists, but why this thing is important. So by the end of the assignment, I'm able to say, you know, the basic structures of how to write a history paper, but I give them a lot of free rein in how they do that.
Super interesting. A couple of questions, really, really interesting and rich questions in the chat. I wanted to ask you, and I'm going to get to some of the particulars here, but I wanted to ask you something about how the kind of approach that you're suggesting may make us vulnerable, that is, as faculty members. And I noticed there was a quick question when I went over onto Twitter right at the beginning here as we were getting started, just to say, yay, I'm in this. And I noticed Jen Sessions made this point about how this is a highly gendered gathering here. We are, you know, this group of nearly 100 people, a lot of women in this group. And I'm so grateful for our colleagues who are not identifying as women who have joined us in this conversation. But that's pretty intense dynamic here. And also we know as women faculty, it can be hard to be the authority figure in your classroom. When do you need to be the authority figure? When do students need you to be the authority figure? And when do they not? And how do we navigate the vulnerability that we're inviting with some of what you're suggesting? I know you have great thoughts that will reorient us around this axis of authority and vulnerability.
I think that this does mean making yourself more vulnerable, and that is something that really each person has to make a decision about what vulnerabilities they want to show and what they don't. We are mostly women in here, but also I see a lot of faces that appear to me to be white, right? And it's a very different situation if you are someone who is Black or Indigenous or Latina and you're in this situation. So there are things that my colleagues have done that I really admire. My colleagues insist on being called doctor or professor, for example, but then still use these kinds of assignments. There are ways to sort of make clear what your expertise is and why you are the person in front of that class that still leave you open to be able to do creative things with your syllabus and assignments. I also think that this is why I say, please don't try and change everything at once. Change one thing at a time, see if it works. If it does, change another thing. If it doesn't, ask yourself why that thing didn't work, and is there a new way to approach it? Just jumping in wholesale and saying, I'm going to make every single one of these changes is something that is daunting and time consuming. And I think it's also something that doesn't speak to the reality that we each individually have based on which institutions we are at, based on who our student body is, based on our social identities and all of those things put together.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. A related question is about, that's also come up in the chat, and I'm combining a couple of things here, is about how we respond to students' anxiety that some of what you're describing may not feel to them rigorous enough. And I guess I want to package that a little bit with some of your comments early on about how we need to kind of unlearn what we learned about being teachers. But in some ways, we have to kind of unlearn what they think is students and what they understand as rigor and so on. So I wondered if you could help us address that, again, for ourselves as well as, you know, how we're helping our students.
The number one thing that I do to answer that in my own classes is to be completely transparent with them about why I'm making the pedagogical choices that I am. So I don't ask them to do anything without explaining why we're doing it. And if I can't explain a good reason why we're doing it, then that's a cue for me to go back to the drawing board. So for instance, in my classes, they start every week by doing a little review of what they learned the week before. I specifically tell them not to use their notes, just to get things out of their brain. And I explained that this is called retrieval practice, and it's one of the best ways to help someone remember things in the long term. When my students start to see that that's true, that they do remember these things better by doing this retrieval practice, I've had wholesale buy-in to those little check-ins every Monday because they see the value in them. I think that's true of anything that we do in the classroom. We must be able to say to them, this is why we're doing it. And then this assures them that we're not just making this up, but there is a real reason for doing it the way that we're doing it that can get to some of those concerns about rigor. I also think a lot of our students, I teach a course on history pedagogy that is for undergraduate students. And every single student in that class comes away going, I had no idea what you all do to make this work, right? So I think that transparency is important because they really don't often know that we're making very deliberate and considered choices.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. I loved just the way you've underscored transparency, which was, of course, a big part of your first presentation about being kind and, sort of taking space for ourselves and our students. And the role of transparency in all of this just seems incredibly important. It requires us to be reflective and then transparent about that process. Okay, a related question is, what about institutional requirements? Many of us teach at places where we're required to give students a rubric, or we're required to, propose assignments of X number of pages or whatever, even according to the level of the class. And so there are two pieces to this question, I guess. How can we talk with our colleagues and administrators about those requirements and how what we're doing is actually proposing something more meaningful for the students' learning? But then secondarily, how can we deal with our colleagues' expectations around, again, this kind of rigor issue?
Yeah. I think that, I know that there are some really wonderful articles that have been written about rubrics, for example, where they let students down sometimes. I will be happy to make those available and to make a resource list of those kinds of articles so that they're things that you can share, read for yourself, share with others, share with people in the administration so that they can see there's being research done on this stuff. It's not just people going like, I don't want to use a rubric, right? I think that convincing people who don't believe that there's any other way to show rigor than, certain kinds of questions in certain kind of exam formats and things like that. I do not believe it is our job to try and persuade absolutely everyone. I believe that that kind of labor falls unequally on different shoulders in the academy. I think that we can make our knowledge known when it is useful to us. But please don't feel that because you have a new way of approaching things that then you must become an evangelist for it. There's lots of other ways of getting material to people, like articles, like books. At my institution, we have started a book club where we meet and talk. We've done all kinds of things where we've had sort of special focuses for a professional development thing, and everybody's read the same stuff, but that's not as regularized as a book club, of course. And slowly but surely, people who at first would have thought that this was nothing they wanted anything to do with are starting to come around and see the value in what is being done. So I would say, don't feel that you must evangelize. Take care of yourself and the demands upon your time and your labor. And use the other materials that are out there in the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning to make a case.
Thank you, Cate. You're great. I think this totally just really, just let me just say, you are terrific. And you've been so thoughtful about this, and so thoughtful with how you work for your students and how you are sharing this with others and how we can work with our students. A couple of questions have come up around what it takes to do this. You know, I think you addressed that right at the end there where you said, you know, take care of yourself. In the chat, some questions around how do we do this kind of work? I'm not going to make this personal and say, Cate, how are you doing all this? but how do we do this when we are juggling so many other demands? How this is genuine. In some ways, this is care work for our students. All teaching is care work. It's either bad care or good care, I guess. But how do we juggle these demands? And I guess embedded in that is a perception that what you're advocating for is more onerous, is more time consuming than maybe some traditional methods of teaching. And if I could even load onto that and say, is there a way to scale this up too? That's a related thing.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I know that's a lot nested in those questions.
No, that's totally cool. I think that, well, I know that what I have found is that I'm taking less time to do so much than I was. Trusting my students, not constantly being on guard and hypervigilant for some perceived slight, is immensely freeing. It has enabled me to let go of a lot of things that I would have worried about before. I am not as all consumed by trying to police my students as I once was. So there's a basic level in which I have greater freedom, I think, now than I did. Some of the things I propose do take less time. So I used to spend forever writing on papers, forever. I was a terrible person in terms of writing, doing lots and lots of line edits, for example. When I switched to having conversations with my students, those students said they are 15-minute appointments. That is much less time than I used to spend per paper. So it saved me a lot of time in that sense. And the quality of the interaction is so much better than me writing on the paper itself. In terms of scalability, it's not possible, I know, for some people to be able to sit down for 15 minutes with every one of their students. That's where I think the self-eval is really useful, because you get to hear your student's voice as you're grading, but you are not actually sitting down with them. I also have moved away, after learning some stuff with some really incredible writing instructors, from line editing. If I line edit, I do one paragraph just to show what some common problems are. But otherwise, I concentrate on the two big things that someone could do to do a better job next time. So I don't waste a lot of time on, here's what you're doing really badly, unless it's so egregious that it really needs addressing. Instead, what I'm saying is, here's what you're good at, and here's how we make it even stronger. Two things I want you to bear in mind for your next paper. And students find that much more manageable. It's a lot less time consuming for me, and it pays much bigger dividends in the quality of their work moving forward. Did I answer everything you asked?
Yeah, I think actually you did take on all of that package of how to balance and how to scale. Extraordinary, thank you. Another question that's come up is about how do we encourage students who may be frustrated, and maybe even particularly in this kind of online, almost dissociated environment. How can we encourage them, and how can we help them not just turn off, tune out, and give up? It's, you know, the number of students who drop out of school is extraordinary. And in this environment, we're losing ever more students. Are there kind practices we can take advantage of in order to help support them to stay in the game?
Some of the things that I do that come immediately to mind. One is that I do a pre-course survey before classes begin, where I ask students to disclose only what they're comfortable disclosing. They can disclose nothing at all. But to ask them if they're experiencing housing insecurity, food insecurity, to ask them if there's anything that they want me to know, to ask them very specifically if they want one of 5 different fidget toys that I keep in stock. And I will mail those to them. Now that is, I tend to pay for the fidget toys, but my department pays for the postage. Not everybody is in a financial situation where that is possible. So, please weigh that in your circumstance. But sending out those fidget toys is a great way of keeping people's attention going and showing that you're really invested in them. I also think that I have, with every check-in that we do, so I talked about the reading check-ins I do every week. And then there's also a check-in I talked about what did we do last week check-in. There's also a reading check-in about how much of the reading they did and what they thought was important. And the last question on each of those little Google forms is there anything else you want me to know? And that's a place where my students can alert me to things that are going on in their life, whether it's academic or personal. And I can make sure that I then reach out to them via email and say, hey, I saw that you said this. What can we do? I would say going along with that, boundaries are super important. I am not trying to be a therapist. I'm not trying to solve every problem for my students. What I'm trying to do is figure out who do they need to talk to, which office do I need to call, whose email do I need to give them so that they can get the help that they really need. The other thing that I do is I have my students at the beginning of term write their own learning goals, which sounds dry and terrible, but I ask them to write up to 5 learning goals for themselves. And then we check in with those throughout the term. So like in week 3, we'll say like, what progress have you made towards those learning goals? Do you need to tweak them? Is there something else you want to really put in that list? This keeps them focused and motivated because I don't tell them this is what you're going to learn. They decide for themselves, this is what I want to get out of this class.
I think that's great, Cate. In many ways, students can see those goals and feel overwhelmed, oh, I didn't meet them. But by proposing it in such a, kind of, do they need to be revised? Asking the question differently can make all the difference. Mm-hmm. Okay, we have had lots of questions in the chat, but Martha and I are going to take good care to preserve the chat, and we'll see if we can get some of those questions answered later. I want to just remind everyone that yes, the recording will be available on the OI's website. We will get back to Cate to see if we can talk with her about creating some resources and post those as a link to the recording. Cate's been very kind to give us the time she has. We will talk with her about a little more of that time. But I hope you'll all just unmute briefly here or use your reaction button and thank Cate with me for another wonderful, invigorating hour of conversation about something that's so important for all of us, which is teaching and learning. So thank you, Cate. Take care. Bye-bye.